SUTP-Webinar on Gender and Urban Transport. My name is Christina Kebeck. I'm a Transport Policy Advisor at GIZ and I'm your moderator for today. I'm very glad to have the support of two excellent speakers, Heather Allen and Sonal Shah, who will share their experiences on the topic of gender and transport with us. Before I introduce our speakers, I have to give some short technical remarks. You should all see this control panel as attendee. You are muted from the beginning so that we have no interferences. I hope that everybody can listen and understand us well. In case you have problems, I recommend to firstly check the sound check in the upper right corner. During the webinar, you have the possibility to raise questions to our panelists. We had good experiences in collecting questions via the chat function in the lower right corner. However, if you would like to elaborate your input or questions via microphone, you can indicate this to us in the chat function and I can unlock your microphone later on. But we come to that at the very end or at the question part of our webinar for today. So for now, let me introduce you our two speakers. Heather Allen. Heather is an independent consultant with more than 20 years of international experience and is a highly regarded expert in gender, urban transport, sustainable development, and climate change. She has worked at UITP, the International Association of Public Transport, and with the UK's Transport Research Laboratory Sustainable Transport Group. Since becoming an independent consultant, her projects include an international review of women's personal security, gender and urban transport, and a major study in 3 American cities, Buenos Aires, Quito, and Santiago. And Heather will later on introduce this study to us as well, I believe. Our second excellent speaker for today is Sonal Shah. She's an architect and urban planner. Currently, she's the senior manager of the Institute of Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP, in India, where she is guiding the urban planning and gender strategy, projects, research, and capacity building initiatives. Sonal has issued varied publications, most recently on Women in Urban Transport Policy Brief together with Safety Pin. And prior to her current position, she has worked as an independent consultant and as consultant for the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. I'm very pleased to have the two of you on board and introduce us to this very interesting topic of gender and transport. And let me now give the word to our first speaker, Heather, who will introduce to us this topic and point out the various dimensions which gender and transport hold. So please, let's now switch to Heather.
Very much, Christina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. We're really delighted to have so many people that have signed up for this this webinar. I hope everyone can hear me correctly. Please indicate that in the control panel chat box if you can't hear me or if you can't see my screen. So just to kick off, okay. I think it's really important to start off by thinking really why do we need to work more on gender in urban transport and in transport in general. Of course, we know that women represent more than 50% of the world's population. That's correct. There's a slight bias when babies are born, where there are slightly more males than females. But as people age, then it's very clear that actually the world's population becomes more female biased, and over 50 and 60 years old, there are more women than men. So we have a right, as it were, to enjoy transport as well as men. In terms of just basic rights. You know, the concept of basic human rights gives everyone a freedom of movement, and women should be able to enjoy movement, mobility as freely as men. That is a basic human right that has been agreed by all the governments internationally, worldwide. It's also incredibly important that women should be able to have equal access to education, jobs, health and other services, and that this access should not be restricted by code, creed, or anything else. Obviously, there are social norms around the world which do restrict and constrain women's movements, but I think that we do need to reflect on that. We've seen changes in, you know, one of the most restrictive cultures in Saudi Arabia in the recent past. So women need to stand up more and make sure that within the right context and in a safe and secure environment, they are able to have equal access, particularly to education. It's also statistically proven that women are more likely to be poor than men. As we've seen many changes in demographic trends, it's not only to do with aging, but also we are becoming more urbanized as a global population, and this includes more women in urban areas. And there's an increasing number of women heads of households in urban areas. These are many single mothers, and I think that the issue with respecting women's needs when it comes to transport will have a great impact on their poverty levels. And I think that this is also well documented in scientific papers. It's not yet clearly recognized within transport, however. We also know that there's an international recognition and a great trend at the moment. We've seen many agreements in the last couple of years, namely the New Urban Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, which has a specific goal on gender and also one on inclusive cities. There's no actual transport goal, but there are many other aspects and goals and targets within the SDGs that refer to women's empowerment and to stop violence against women and girls. The Climate Change Agreement is also, the Paris Accord is an important agreement as well, and not necessarily so much in this context, but women actually take the brunt of many of the impacts of climate change. There is also a need, as we become urbanized, that cities develop in inclusive and sustainable ways. And quite frankly, cities cannot really have the ambition to be inclusive if women and girls and children and adolescents cannot travel freely and safely. And this benefits, obviously, everybody. It benefits what one normally calls the vulnerable groups, that would be maybe those that are slightly less able in one way or another, but also the children and elderly. And this brings many benefits to cities themselves, and they are, when they become more inclusive, and they can become more economically dynamic as well. I'm just, whoops, sorry, oh, my screen will not, for some reason, okay, sorry, I couldn't move the slide on. So therefore, transport plays a very critical role in improving women's quality of life all over the world and at all income levels. And the quality of transport that women can enjoy impacts family life and poverty, as I've mentioned. And this has a positive effect as well on national GDP. We know that women take the main amount of unpaid care work, and some researchers established that this unpaid care work on a global level represents about $10 billion US. So if we can shift more women from this informal work, it's very often informal work, about 80% of the world's domestic workers that work without real contracts are women, then that would actually have a significant impact on the economic development of the world. And CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, has done some work on this, and they estimate that around 23% of the increase that has been seen in the region since 2005 has been in the main due from bringing more women into the formal employment sector. So there's a real, a real economic argument here. It's very well known that women travel differently to men, and most of this is dependent on the strong care relationships that women have. They look after the children, they look after elderly parents from both sides of the family, they look after aunts and uncles, and friends as well. So they do a lot of trips. Men tend to make more direct trips associated with their jobs, whereas women, even if they're working, will do what we call trip chaining. So they'll start at their house and then go possibly to the school to deposit the children, go and do a quick shop for the evening meal or lunch or whatever, pop into the pharmacy, maybe go and see the parents, go back to the school, go to work. We know they do a lot of different trips. And the time of travel as well is very traditionally, although this is changing with flexi time, that men do more of a 9 to 5 kind of day, whereas women will travel at all times of the day and make a lot of trips also in off-peak, but not always. And there is quite a lot of research to show that women accompanying children to school actually have a significant impact on the congestion levels, both congested public transport services, but also on the roads, because they accompany their children to school and their children are not able to independently go to school. So it comes as no surprise that women use public transport and they depend on public transport more than men. So this is a slide based on the recent work in the 3 cities that Christina kindly mentioned. We found there from surveys in all 3 cities that women use public transport slightly more than men, as you can see from these figures. It's not a huge amount more, but it is more. And they also tend to use buses. Obviously, we know that women walk as their main mode of transport. The second mode that they use in the majority of cases are buses. Very often they are cheaper than rail services, but also they go to the many destinations that women need to travel to. While it depends a little bit on the stage of life of the women and whether they have children or not. We have also seen that younger women, particularly young professional women, use rail services as much as men, but once they become mothers, then they tend to go back to using the bus. This really isn't taken very much into consideration when it comes to planning, and I'll cover that a little bit later in the presentation. We also know that one of the key problems with public transport is that it is a pretty dangerous environment for women. This work was done by the Thomson Reuters Foundation in 2014 and 15, and they did a survey with YouGov for the majority of the main cities in the world. It certainly doesn't cover all of them, and it doesn't cover the mid-level cities. So the worst city that came out, in fact, was Mexico City, and then came Bogota, Lima, and Tokyo, Delhi being the 5th most dangerous city, and Jakarta and Manila and Moscow closely following. Interestingly, we have New York, London, and Paris as number 14, 15, and 16. So this is not a developing world issue. It happens all over the world, and it happens in the majority, if not all, public transport systems. It's really to the level that it happens, that there is insecure environments, a lot of harassment. And harassment, as you can see from this slide, is very often considered to be verbal, visual, physical, and the Thomson Reuters looked at safety at night. But generally, safe travel and safe travel at night is a very clear indication of how safe the system is. So Latin America, where I've just been working, has really some of the most dangerous transport systems in the world. This is not exclusive, as Sonal will mention. She will go into more of the aspects that are happening in India, which was the country that really kicked us off, really looking at how personal security affects women's transport behavior and possibilities, with that very distressing rape and murder, really, of the young girl in Delhi in 2015, a couple of years back now. So here we have some statistics from the Inter-American Development Bank showing the percentage of women who have either been victims or suffered from verbal aggression or sexual aggression, harassment in these cities. And you can see it's between 60 and nearly 70%. And this corresponds or correlates very closely to the work that we found. So if we think about change, because something has to change, that's for sure, what we need to think about as to where can we make these changes, because it's up to women as well to step up to this, this challenge. And it's very clear that we need more women as decision makers. And here we have Violetta Bulc, who's the European Commissioner for Transport. You can't get much higher than that in the European Commission as a commissioner. She is very much in a leadership position, and she has recently launched a very interesting platform to try and encourage more employment opportunities for women. Apparently, according to the research that the Commission has done, only 22% of the whole transport sector are women in employment. So that includes aviation, maritime, as well as urban and rural transport and construction. So that's a pretty low percentage, and we need to change that. We actually also need to step into jobs within the transport sector. So women as suppliers of transport. So there are plenty of opportunities for women to be bus drivers. This picture shows a bus driver in Yichang in the BRT in China. Traffic agents, and I'll give you an example for that. There are really a number of very interesting opportunities for women as suppliers. And this extends also to, obviously, planners and researchers. And then we need to look at how women as users of transport need to be more vocal about what they need, what their requirements are, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and where they would like change to happen. Because even if a city currently is interested in making some change, it's not very interesting, it's not very easy for them to really find out how they can make this change. So this slide gives you some specifics about what to consider when a city might be looking, or a decision maker may be looking to develop more gender sensitive transport. And there are really a large number of areas that need to be addressed. And this is probably one of the reasons why it's kind of not been really taken and shaken by transport planners and project developers, because it's not an easy aspect. It's a very complex issue, and you need a lot of different inputs from different stakeholders. So that doesn't make it simple. However, there are, I think, and in the period of time that I've been working on this issue since the early 2000s, really I've seen a lot of change and a lot of good work that's going on. There's been significant increases in public awareness campaigns, and of course IT is very useful for this. The fact that the majority of people have a mobile phone now. They might not have data roaming, which limits the internet connection, and how sometimes to integrate reporting into that. But the majority, even if you are relatively poor, you have a mobile phone and you can afford an SMS. Both of these two campaigns actually use that way of helping to get people to start reporting on harassment as well as criminal acts. In the study, we found that between 70 and 90% of incidents are not reported. So reporting is a really important aspect that needs to change. There's a lot of change also in getting people into positions. This is an example from the Trans-Santiago bus network, where Stephanie won the prize for the best bus driver, female bus driver on the system. And this is done by public vote, which is really nice. There is obviously a prize for the best man bus driver as well. But by giving one to the best female bus driver, this highlights the opportunity for others to actually think, well, I could learn to drive a bus. And Stephanie also goes out into schools and talks to young girls that they could themselves also drive a bus. And it starts opening doors for people to step up into these positions, because if women do not apply, then they'll never be able to get there. But it's a more complex picture than that. In Buenos Aires, they have made a big positive action to try and recruit more traffic agents as well. And of course, this service side and safety side, women are very good at. Women tend to follow the rules better than men. And when it comes to safety, that's a really important aspect to consider. In 2017, the city made a big recruitment drive, and they managed to attract 65% of the respondents to the employment advertising were female, and they were able to recruit a significant number of females into the traffic unit. So now they have around 50% of all their traffic agents are female, which is great. And they're also looking at getting the subway drivers up to 20%. And unfortunately, at the moment, there's a bit of resistance from the rail unions that women are not able to drive trains on the national rail system. But I think we're working on trying to change that. Quito has also done a significant amount, particularly on women's personal security. And they've had a number of programs. The first one was Cuéntame, which was basically as a number of kiosks in key places and key stations where women could go and actually talk about an experience that they had had or seen in full confidentiality. And this also helped to increase the number of reports that were made to the security agents. And that has been now extended into a much more ambitious program where there is this SMS number where somebody can send an SMS while they're actually on the bus, and the bus driver will then be alerted that there is something going on in his bus at that moment. A public announcement will be made on that bus, and at the next stop or the stop after, a security agent should be present. It could be a station security agent to see if they can actually find the perpetrator. And this has increased enormously the number of reports and the number of prosecutions. There's been a wider number of measures being done in Quito, including a new local ordinance about the fact that harassment is a criminal offense. So people are aware that they will get prosecuted if they are caught, because this is one of the main reasons behind men harassing women. They feel that they are able to get away with it. Now, women-only services is a very, very thorny issue, of course, and as I mentioned, the whole topic of gender in urban transport is complex. And separation or integration is a great debate. There are a number of cities, of course, that have this type of service. From the research that I've done and the number of focus groups that I've taken part in, I can see it being very suitable for specific conditions and specific needs, but not as a single standalone measure. It is not a solution, because what happens is that as women become more empowered and are able to travel more, they have fewer and fewer services that they can use, and it creates polarization and tension between men and women. As social democratic trends change, of course, we know that some men are staying behind and looking after the children as well. So where do they get in? Are they able to get into this women-only carriage or not? It works, on both sides. So it's really something that a city would need, or a government needs to consider extremely carefully, and only in certain cases. However, on-demand services is a slightly different kettle of fish, as it were, and this can provide really the mobility, and particularly that last mile mobility that restricts women from using all types of public transport, because the walk to and from the public transport station and stop needs to be as safe as the travel in the vehicle. This is an example of pink rickshaws in Pakistan. And there are also a number of lady-only taxi services now, and a growing number of them. And of course, this, on the one hand, provides employment, but on the other hand, provides mobility for women in a safe environment as well. So I would like to encourage you to download this summary report, and there will be soon a toolkit as well that can be downloaded on this study in the 3 cities in Latin America, Ella se mueve segura. This was a study done in Santiago, Quito, and Buenos Aires, where we used exactly the same methodology in each of those cities at the same time. And I think that has really helped to develop a methodology that works in all the cities, and to collect comparable data. So this is not really something that, it only happens in our city because we have such poor public transport. No, it happens in every city, but there are contextual aspects that are specific to your city. And the other thing that I think has brought very much together is the sharing of knowledge and the sharing of best practices and examples, of which there are a number from all the cities, but also from other places. So thank you very much for your attention, and that's my email contact details, and of course my Twitter account, which I fully encourage you to follow me on. So thank you. Over to Christina.
That was just great. Thank you very much, Heather. So before we give the word to Sonal, I'd like to thank the audience for the questions that you already sent, and please just go ahead, and whenever you've got a question, write it down into our chat, and we'll bundle them and hand them over to our speakers later on. But for now, I'd like to give the word to Sonal, our second speaker for today, and she'll introduce us to policy approaches on gender and transport in India, and including the practical application of the safety pin app. So, Sonal, it's now your turn. Thank you. Okay. Sonal, can you hear us?
Yes, just a second. Okay, so thank you, Heather, for setting the global context, and I will use that as a framework to talk about what we have done or learned from India. So, in a study done by Strategy and PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2012, they estimated that about 865 million women, equivalent to the third billion after the billion populations of India and China, were expected to enter the global economy. While this is a promising aspect, and it therefore raised questions in how could governments and the private sector create enabling working environments for women, what we have found in India is that there has been, in fact, a drop in the labor force participation of women, large extent driven by decline in rural workforce, but also seeing a stagnant female urban workforce participation. While there are numerous socioeconomic reasons for this, we do know that the performance, if you will, of urban transport services places different burdens on both men and women, with the costs of poor public transport often being borne by women. Just looking at data on other workers, that is workers in non-agricultural and non-agricultural occupations in urban areas by the Census of India in 2011, we found that, for example, 73% of all trips to work were by sustainable modes of transport, right? However, women constituted only 14% of those trips. But when you actually looked at the mode share amongst women themselves, one of the big things that we found, which was that 35% of women, in fact, worked from their place of residence. And this is something that women do in order to manage both their care and productive responsibilities. If you removed this portion out, we found that 84% of trips by women were by walking, bicycling, paratransit, bus, train, water transport, etc. So therefore, 4 out of every 5 women or so were using these modes of transport to work. Now remember that this is still likely to undercount women's trips because this only looks at productive, if you will, productive or employment trips and not care trips. Similarly, we analyzed data for some of India's largest cities, such as Bombay, Calcutta, which is in Bangalore, Calcutta, Mumbai, Chennai, and Delhi. And across these cities, you find that a higher percentage of women walk to work. The bicycle modal shares are significantly lower. They are traveling sometimes equally or more by bus. So for example, even surprisingly in a city like Delhi, which is the last bar graphs on the right, is that you have a higher percentage of women using buses to commute to work than men. Also looking at other data points in order to establish what we understand as the shelter, transport and livelihoods link, we see that a greater percentage of women are actually working from place of residence and therefore not traveling. And second, that the trip distances tend to be shorter than those undertaken by men for work. When we look at sexual harassment, studies by a number of women's organizations across India have illustrated that women face harassment not only in public transport, but on the streets while accessing and waiting for public transport. This is data for Delhi, Mumbai, 46% on buses, 17% on trains. Calicut, you have 69% on buses, 71% while accessing public transport. And in a city like Lucknow, we have about 88% of women reported instances of sexual harassment. Heather did mention that in December 2012, there was this reached its peak, which compelled government and governments at multiple levels to take action. Talking about employment, while Heather mentioned that about 22% of the women constituted 22% of the entire transport sector in Europe, we have data for India where women were only 6.85%. As per the International Labour Organization, and we know that the transport sector is considered as a no place, if you will, for women. So what have been some of the policy responses? While there has been an acknowledgement that of sexual harassment in transport, women's issues are still considered as special cases with project level and technological centric interventions. Just today, we read about how buses and taxis across the country will now have to install GPS devices and panic buttons, right? But there is still, and we still have to acknowledge that these have to be made part of a much larger set of interventions and not only these. Like we said, that transport plans and indicators are not gender responsive. Many city urban mobility plans, for example, do not even have gender disaggregated data on mode shares of transportation or collect data to understand the qualitative experience of different stages of a transportation journey. Gender, again, is not considered a core competence in urban local bodies who consider themselves to provide basic services and is perceived to be within the domain of women's programs and departments. Within this context, ITDP and Safety Pin, we together released a report on women and transport in Indian cities, making specific recommendations to decision makers and policy makers at the national, state, and city levels in order to provide guidance on on how to create gendered mobility plans. Here, I will just present a broad framework. One was saying the first thing we did was to recommend indicators that could become part of city mobility plans, as well as set a process that would measure gendered mobility patterns. Like I said, make visible the mobility of care, trip chaining patterns, women's time poverty, women's forced mobility, and women's forced immobility as well, along with their aspirations from an urban transportation system. Set goals and set measurable goals that can hold a city accountable and hold multiple departments accountable to achieve those goals. The table on the left recommends indicators and benchmarks that could be used. And third is to create an institutional framework for implementation. One of the challenges is that urban transport in India is not the responsibility of a single authority, and therefore this requires institutional coordination as well as a framework to make different departments work together. And after that, create a mechanism to monitor and evaluate along with the participation of women's groups, and making them central to this process, and sharing knowledge to inform future projects so that there is institutional memory. Along with this, we made specific mode-specific recommendations, which included, for example, creating safe and comfortable walking environments for women and girls, that is reducing walking distances, because we know that larger blocks would disproportionately affect women, as a majority of their trips are by walking and by public transport. Designing pedestrian infrastructure using a level of service approach, as well as thinking about 3 different zones on our sidewalks, designing safe crossing facilities, and using safety audits in order to understand the qualitative perception of our streets and public spaces. Here I'd like to draw upon the work done by SafetyPin, which is basically a technological platform that collects information on streets through 8 parameters of lighting, presence of people, presence of transportation services, openness, number of security personnel, gender diversity, visibility, availability of walking path, and the last parameter, which is feeling, is a subjective perception. Each of these criteria have 4 other sub-criteria to allow an objective assessment. So how does it work? So once you install the app on your phone, you are, say, for example, within a neighborhood, you will get a safety score of that neighborhood. It has another feature like Stay With Me, which will give your details and track you and share them with your friends and family that you select. You can also do a safety audit and submit the safety audit based on these 9 parameters. And you can also select a safe route. So what they have done is that overlaid safety audits along with Google Maps, which can recommend a safe route to you. In addition to this, SafetyPin has a night application in which the phone is attached to moving vehicles, and they've partnered with Uber in many cities for capturing pictures. These are taken at every 50 meters and uploaded to their system. These pictures are then assessed according to the safety audit parameters. So how does this help? Once these photographs are taken, they are geo-mapped and time-stamped and coded into sub-parameters. For example, if you have looked at visibility, there are 4 parameters which helps you assess whether there are no eyes, whether there are few eyes, that is 5 windows or entrances, less than 5 windows or entrances overlooking a point, more eyes, which is less than 10 windows, and highly visible. So these sub-parameters can therefore be used by government and by planners to make specific recommendations on improving the safety or the perception of safety in a neighborhood. Some applications, for example, in the city of Delhi, SafetyPin has worked with the Public Works Department on fixing close to 8,000 dark spots. And SafetyPin has now been asked to do a second round of audits to evaluate how the safety score will change. SafetyPin is now in about 30 cities globally and 10 countries. In Nairobi, it has been used to make recommendations to street lighting and improvement of walking infrastructure. Looking at how, for example, like I mentioned, that women's cycling shares are very, very low in Indian cities, and one of our big recommendations was to use urban design behavioral measures and creating a cycling economy to increase women's cycling shares. This means in creating, for example, dedicated cycle tracks on roads 20 meters and above and traffic calming roads below that to create a safer environment of cycling, and combining these as the city of Santiago, where a bicycle network plan over 2007 to 12 quadrupled the number of cycle tracks in the city. And they also had Marcoleta, which is an organization that worked with women in order to, one, train women who didn't know how to cycle, and created groups for women who were afraid to cycle by themselves. And what this did is that, on one hand, cycling modal shares increased from 3 to 6% over a decade from 2006, but also increased women's cycling shares from 10% to 30% of all cycles. A city, Bogota, for example, has also used safety pin data to determine where to install street lights, where to install CCTV cameras, and where to place the bicycle stand to encourage more women and girls to bicycle. Our next recommendation, which is 7, was increasing women's safety and use of public transport, which includes route planning and operations, that is, understanding women's travel during the peak and the off-peak hours as well. And some initiatives which have been implemented, for example, by cities like Toronto and Montreal, is request a stop or hail a service, which allows women earlier, but now all passengers between 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. to get off at a destination at a stop as close to your destination along the public transport route. This also looks at thinking about fares so as to reduce the burden of trip chaining. And fare integration between different modes of transport helps in this case. Using safety audits to improve or design infrastructure along with the level of service approach. An example in case, again, is the transparent bus shelters in Toronto, which are a result of the safety audits undertaken then. Designing vehicles, which includes, for example, looking at width of gangways where men and women stand, thinking about women doors so that you have separate entrances, for example, for men and women to board and alight, lower handlebars, and having information on helpline and emergency line numbers within the public transport vehicle. Like Heather mentioned, information and communication also is a big piece of it. Some examples around this would include communication campaigns to encourage women to report incidents of violence, to discourage potential perpetrators, as well as encourage bystanders to intervene. Case and example is the Edmonton Transport Service, which adopted a communication campaign with a zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment, and used posters and advertisements to communicate what constituted sexual harassment, which included staring, groping, etc., and indicating that this was unacceptable. Information also includes multiple levels of information, from communicating real-time information on the arrival of public transport, along with static information such as maps, which communicate major destinations around a public transport stop, but also public infrastructure like public toilets, and in other cases, primary health centers, and so forth. Recommendation 8 is engendering public transport authorities, that is increasing the number of women within different departments and management levels within public transport authorities. We have actually recommended a gender advisory committee to make gender equality a core duty within the authority, review all public transportation plans for gender responsive planning, implementation, and evaluate impact, create and implement a capacity building program, define protocols to prevent and address sexual harassment in public transport, as well as enable recruitment, retaining, promotion of women at all levels, and facilitate gender sensitization trainings for drivers, conductors, depot managers, and leadership. These are some examples that have, these were trainings conducted by a women's organization, Jagori, with bus drivers in Delhi. We know, for example, that intermediate public transport is in many cities in India, and especially in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, the main form of public transportation in the city. And so our recommendations were to recognize it as a mode of transport so that its services could be regulated. And some of the things we've recommended again is verification, police verification of drivers and in some cases conductors, gender sensitization of drivers and conductors, sheltered, safe, well-lit waiting areas, amongst others. This is a broad gamut. We do acknowledge, one, that we will need an institutional mechanism in order to make multiple departments and transportation agencies come together to work together along with the police. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sonal. That was really great and impressive. I'll switch the screen. For now, I'd like to introduce the questions session for the last couple of minutes. We had many questions which came up during the two of you were presenting the findings, and some general ones. For instance, regarding recommendations for up-to-date studies about the economic and social benefits of gender-sensitive planning. Do you know of any recommendations for such studies? Maybe I will give the word to Sonal from ITDP India, who could answer this.
Yeah. So I think there is one a study by the McKinsey Global Institute in 2014, which actually spoke about the economic benefits of equal participation of women as men in the workforce. And I think they estimated an increase of anywhere between 12 to 24 billion USD. I think this is a study by the McKinsey Global Institute in 2014.
Thank you. That was already a great link. And another question is regarding the accessibility of also transgender and genderqueer people. So is this embedded in a general discussion on accessibility for minorities, or is this something you are talking also about when you talk about gender and transport? Maybe I'm asking this to Heather. Okay, Heather is somehow muted, so now back to you. What do you think?
Now yes. I'm unmuted, sorry. Oh.
Okay, now Heather is unmuted. So first Heather, please, and maybe Sonal would like to add something.
Thank you.
Did you hear the question, Heather?
Yes, I did, absolutely. And also in terms of the first question, I know that you'll mention a few resources as well at the end, but there is a growing body of evidence, in fact, looking at this economic aspect. And the World Economic Forum has also some interesting reports that might be worth people looking at on a global basis. In terms of transgender and other more specific aspects of gender, it is true. I mean, I forgot to mention that when we've been using the word gender, we have in the main been talking about women, people who represent themselves as women, but that's mainly because it's much more of an easy ask. With policymakers and decision makers and public transport operators. That said, many of these specific aspects are appropriate to help those other groups, because making it more gender sensitive, more women gender sensitive, actually help vulnerable men. It also helps adolescents. And so I think there's a lot of work still to be done in that transgender aspect, but it's a step in the right direction at least.
Yes, I will. I would like to say that as far as the experience of transgender persons in streets, public spaces, and public transport, I think is to a large extent not been mapped. This is which is why we realized this while we were writing our policy brief, and therefore we decided that we would we would first only speak about women and transport in Indian cities. But so I think this is a very, very, if you will, glaring gap in existing research, and especially in Indian cities. We are finding some anecdotal evidence, and this is primarily based on newspaper articles, that transgender and especially trans women are facing a lot of harassment. For example, in buses, where women don't feel comfortable sitting with them in the reserved seats in buses, and then they can be harassed by men when they are sitting in the general area. Or, for example, they are not allowed to use public toilet facilities because there is this ambiguity about their gender. And so I think that this is something, one, that we really need to look at because in my understanding, it will change some of our approaches as well, and expand the discussion too.
Thank you, the two. Another question, which Sonal, I think, refers to the safety pin app, is regarding the storage of data. So who stores data and who gets access to the data? And can cities use it? And how can this be transferred to other cities?
Right. So, for example, right now, anybody can use the safety pin application. You do need to have access, one, to a smartphone. And if you install the application, and you can get access to all the safety pin locations as well as the audits. Right. So anyone who has installed this application has access to this data. And so from this point of view, even governments would have access to this data as well. So it is an open source software, and you will be, so for example, if you have conducted an audit on a particular street or in a particular area, I can see that audit and see how it has been rated as well. So in that sense, it is accessible to anyone who installs the application.
Thank you, Sonal. So as our time is almost up, I'd like to draw attention to one final remark and give the mic to Heather once again, and asking for a very quick answer, because there were questions regarding the value of $10 billion, which appeared to be quite low somehow. And then also that there's the impression that there's not a lot of attention paid to the role a lot of women play, combining households, children, etc. Heather, from your experience of the last 20 years working in this area, do you think that this is still true? What's your opinion about that? Okay, Heather, you've got to unmute yourself once again, please, because we can't hear you. And now I think, Heather, now you can answer and we can hear you. Can't. Okay, but to all attendees, thanks for your question that you sent. We will make sure that we will answer them bit by bit after our webinar today, and we will also give the questions to our experts and forward them and ask them to answer them. So yeah, you might just check later on your email inbox. Okay, so before I'm closing this session, I would very much like to thank Heather and Sonal for giving the presentations and for all these valuable insights. And in addition, of course, I would like to thank all our participants for joining our session on gender and urban transport. Actually, We are conducting SUTP seminars on a regular basis, and our next webinar will be on Monday, 29th of January, on transport in NDCs. And then a week later, we'll have one about reverse innovation, so shared mobility and new mobility services. So you can check that out. And then, of course, we have some recommended reading and information. Of course, our SUTP homepage, the Sustainable Urban Transport Project of GIZ, we have published a lot of reading and training material on various topics. And also there will be an updated module handbook for practitioners available soon on gender and transport. So check that out. And of course, there's also some more reading material on the topic, which other institutions published, and also the report that Heather and Sonal were talking about are shown here. More about GIZ transport and mobility activities you can find here, following all these links that you can now see. At our Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative website, you can currently find information about the Global Urban Mobility Challenge to financially support cities in their ideas to low-carbon, people-centered pilot projects. So if you got a project in mind in your city or with your own app or whatsoever, just click at this transformativemobility.org to get some more information about this mobility challenge and how to get some financial funding for it. Okay, you can find this presentation and the recording very soon at our CAPSUT page. CAPSUT is our capacity building platform on capsut.org. So if there are any further questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. And when you exit the webinar, there will pop up a very short survey, and we warmly welcome you to answer the 3 or 4 questions. And that's it for now. Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.